They tried to sell her, and by sunrise, the same men would not dare meet her eyes. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? The wind that day carried dust through the cracks of every wooden wall in Dry Creek, a town barely worth marking on a map, somewhere between nowhere and forgotten. And inside the saloon, the air smelled of sweat, leather, and cheap whiskey poured too early in the afternoon. Boots scraped across the floorboards as men gathered in a loose circle, their voices low at first, then rising with the kind of careless boldness that comes when a crowd forgets its own conscience. And at the center of it all stood a woman who did not belong to them, not in the way they thought she did. Her dark hair falling in quiet strands over her shoulders, her posture straight despite the weight of every stare pressing down on her, her hands bound not by rope, but by something heavier, the certainty that no one in that room intended to see her as anything more than a problem to be solved or a bargain to be made. And someone laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that bounced off the walls like a bad echo. "Ain't worth much, but she'll work," another voice added, and a few men nodded, not out of agreement, but because it was easier than thinking, easier than questioning why a human life could be reduced to a number spoken between sips of whiskey. She said nothing, not a single word, but her eyes moved, slow, deliberate, taking in each face as if memorizing them, not with anger, not even with fear, but with something quieter, something that unsettled more than any protest ever could, the kind of silence that makes a man wonder if he's already made a mistake he cannot undo. Outside, a horse shifted in the heat, its reins tied loosely to a post, dust curling around its hooves, and on the far edge of the saloon, half hidden in shadow where the light from the swinging doors barely reached, a man sat with his hat pulled low, untouched glass in front of him, watching without appearing to watch. Ethan Cole had been in town less than an hour, long enough to know it wasn't a place that welcomed questions, long enough to understand that sometimes the loudest thing in a room wasn't the voices. It was what nobody chose to stop. "I'll give 20, someone said, tossing the number out like it meant nothing, like it cost nothing, like it carried no weight beyond the sound of it. And a few heads turned, measuring, calculating, deciding whether they cared enough to outbid or simply to be part of the moment. And then, just as the noise began to swell again, just as the crowd leaned further into its own certainty, a voice cut through, not loud, not sharp, but steady enough to make the room pause without knowing why. "I'll take her," Ethan said, and it wasn't the words that silenced them. It was the way he said them, calm, final, as if he wasn't entering the game they were playing, as if he was ending it without asking permission. Chairs creaked as men shifted, eyes turning toward him, trying to read what couldn't be easily read, because there was no smirk, no challenge, no hint of pride or pity in his face, just a quiet decision that didn't seem to belong in a place like Dry Creek. And for the first time since she'd been brought into that room, the woman looked at someone directly, her gaze meeting his across the distance, not with gratitude, not yet, but with a question that hung heavier than anything spoken. And outside, the wind kept moving, carrying dust down the street as if it knew something the town did not, as if it had already begun to erase what these men thought they were building, because out here, in a land where nothing stayed buried for long, even the smallest choice could echo farther than a gunshot, and Ethan Cole had just made one that would follow him long after the dust settled. The laughter did not come all at once. It started with one man near the bar, a low chuckle that slipped out before he could stop it, then another joined, and another, until the room filled with a kind of disbelief that tried to disguise itself as humor, because men like those did not know what to do with a decision that did not ask for their approval. And the sheriff, standing near the far wall with his thumb hooked lazily into his belt, straightened just enough to remind the room that order was supposed to exist here, even if no one could quite define what that order meant anymore. "You sure you know what you are saying, Cole?" he asked, voice careful, not confrontational, but edged with something that suggested this was not a simple transaction, not in a place like Dry Creek where every choice carried a shadow longer than the man who made it. And Ethan did not look at him, did not look at anyone. His eyes remained on the woman as if the rest of the room had already faded into something distant and unimportant. "I said what I meant," he replied, and the words landed flat, steady, without the slightest hint of hesitation, And that was what unsettled them most. Not the act itself, but the absence of doubt behind it. Because doubt was something they understood, something they trusted, but certainty, quiet and unshaken, that was harder to stand against. Someone muttered about money, about rules, about how things were done, and a few men nodded again, clinging to the idea that there had to be a structure, a way to measure what had just happened. But no one stepped forward to challenge him, not directly, because something in the way Ethan stood, shoulders loose, hands empty, told them this was not a man looking for a fight, and somehow that made him more difficult to confront than if he had been. And the woman still had not spoken, though her breathing had steadied. The rise and fall of her chest no longer rushed, her eyes no longer searching the room for escape, but fixed now on the man who had shifted the ground beneath her. Without warning, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, something unspoken and fragile, like the first crack in ice that is held too long. The sheriff cleared his throat again, glancing around as if hoping someone else would take control of the situation, but no one did. So he stepped forward, boots echoing softly against the worn floorboards. "If you are taking responsibility," he said, choosing each word with care, "then you walk her out of here, and whatever comes after is on you." And Ethan gave a slight nod, not in agreement, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if he had already accepted that weight before speaking at all. And without another word, he reached into his pocket and placed a few folded bills on the nearest table, not tossed, not displayed, simply set down as if the act itself did not deserve attention. And that, more than anything, silenced the room again, because it stripped the moment of spectacle, turned it into something plain, almost ordinary, and there was nothing ordinary about it. The door creaked as he pushed it open, sunlight cutting through the dim interior, dust swirling in the beam like something alive, and for a second, no one moved. No one spoke, as if the entire town had forgotten how to react. And then she stepped forward, not pulled, not guided, but choosing to move beside him, her pace steady, her head held just high enough to suggest that whatever had been taken from her before had not been broken, only hidden. And as they crossed the threshold, the wind caught the edge of her clothing, lifting it slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and something older, something the town did not understand. And behind them, the saloon remained quiet, the kind of quiet that lingers long after a storm has passed, when people are left standing in the aftermath, unsure of what has changed, only certain that something has. And out on the street, under the wide, unforgiving sky, Ethan Cole did not look back, because some choices, once made, do not ask for witness. They simply move forward and expect the world to follow. The street outside felt wider than it had any right to be, stretched thin under a sky that offered no shade and no answers. And for a while, they walked without speaking, boots pressing into dry earth, each step lifting small clouds of dust that drifted behind them like something reluctant to let go. And the town watched from a distance, from behind windows and doorframes, from the edges of porches where men leaned just far enough to see without being seen, because curiosity always outlived courage in places like this. And Ethan Cole moved with the same quiet steadiness he had carried inside the saloon, not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate, as if he had already measured the road ahead and found nothing on it worth fearing, while beside him, the woman kept pace, neither close nor distant, her presence like a shadow that chose to stay rather than one that followed by force. And after a dozen steps, maybe more, she spoke. Her voice, low but clear, shaped by an accent that carried the rhythm of another world. "Why?" she asked, not accusing, not grateful, simply asking the question that had been waiting since the moment he spoke inside that room. And Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze fixed ahead where the road bent slightly toward the open land beyond the last row of buildings. And when he finally spoke, it was without turning, without changing his stride. "Because they were wrong," he said, and the words settled. Between them, simple enough to understand, heavy enough to carry more than they explained. And she studied him for a moment, searching for something behind the answer, some hidden reason that would make sense of it, but found only the same quiet certainty that had unsettled the men back in the saloon. And that, more than anything, made her uncertain, because she had seen many kinds of men, had learned the difference between those who acted out of pride and those who acted out of fear, but this one did not fit either shape, and that made him harder to read than any threat she had faced before. The horse waited where he had left it, reins loose, head lowered against the sun, and Ethan paused just long enough to check the saddle strap, his hands moving with practiced ease. Then he stepped back slightly, giving her space without saying so, a gesture small enough to go unnoticed by most, but not by her, and she hesitated, just for a breath, before reaching up and placing her hand against the worn leather, the texture familiar in a way that reminded her of places far from this town, and she mounted with quiet confidence, not asking for help, not needing it. And when she settled into the saddle, her posture shifted, something in her straightening, as if the act itself returned a piece of herself that had been pushed aside, and Ethan followed, swinging up behind her, not close enough to crowd, not distant enough to lose balance, the careful distance of a man who understood boundaries without being told. And for a moment, they sat there, the two of them framed against the open road, neither speaking, neither moving, until the wind picked up again, brushing past them like a reminder that stillness did not last long out here. And with a light nudge of his heel, the horse began to move, slow at first, then steady, carrying them away from Dry Creek and whatever it thought it had just witnessed. And behind them, the town remained quiet, not out of respect, but out of confusion, because nothing about what had just happened fit the stories they told themselves about how the world worked. And ahead, the land stretched wide and uncertain, the kind of place where a man's choices had room to breathe, and where the truth, whatever it was, had nowhere to hide. By the time the town disappeared behind them, it had shrunk into nothing more than a smudge of dust against the horizon, and the land opened wide in a way that made silence feel heavier instead of lighter, the kind of silence that pressed in on a person, forcing thoughts to rise whether they were welcome or not. And the horse carried them at a steady pace, hooves striking dry ground in a rhythm that seemed older than either of them, a rhythm that did not care about what had just happened or what might come next. And for a long while, neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words out here carried weight, and once spoken, they did not easily fade. The sun climbed higher, stretching shadows shorter beneath them, and the heat settled in, wrapping around their shoulders like something patient and unyielding, and she shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting her balance with a familiarity that did not go unnoticed. And Ethan saw it, the way her movements matched the horse instead of fighting it, the way her hands rested without tension, and he said, almost to himself, "You have ridden before," and she gave a small nod, not turning, her gaze fixed on the line where earth met sky. "Since I could walk," she answered, and there was no pride in it, only fact, and something else beneath it, something tied to a life that had not been hers to choose entirely. And he let the words settle, did not press further, because questions, like everything else out here, had their own time. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint scent of sagebrush and distant water, and for a moment, it felt like the land itself was watching, measuring them in a way the town never could. And she spoke again, quieter this time. They would not have stopped, and he knew she did not mean the men in the saloon alone, but everything behind them, everything that had led her there. And he nodded once, a gesture she could feel more than see. "No," he said, and nothing more, because some truths did not need dressing up, and she let out a slow breath, not relief, not quite, but something close to it, like a door opening just enough to let air through. Her hand moved then, almost unconsciously, brushing against something at her neck, and Ethan noticed the motion without looking directly, the glint of something small catching the light for just a second before it disappeared beneath the fabric again, a piece of silver wrapped around stone, worn smooth by time and touch. And there was a story in it. He could tell that much, the kind of story people carried close because it mattered more than anything they would ever say out loud. And he did not ask, not yet, because asking would turn it into something else, something spoken, and not all things needed to be spoken to be understood. The road ahead dipped slightly, leading toward a narrow stretch where the land rose on either side, a natural passage that funneled wind and sound into something sharper. And as they approached it, the horse slowed on its own, ears flicking forward, sensing what neither of them could see yet, and Ethan's hand shifted lightly against the reins, not tightening. not forcing, just listening through the animal beneath him. And she felt it too, the subtle change, the way the air seemed to hold itself differently, and her posture straightened just a fraction more, not in fear, but in awareness. And for the first time since they left the town, she turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back at him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet question that did not need words, and he answered it with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. A slight nod, nothing more, but enough to say that whatever waited ahead, they would meet it without running. And the wind moved again, slipping through the narrow passage with a low, steady whisper, as if the land itself was about to reveal something neither of them had expected. The passage narrowed until the world seemed to fold inward, the open sky reduced to a thin strip above them while the earth rose on either side in quiet, watchful walls, and the horse slowed again, each step more careful than the last, as if it understood something neither rider could yet see, and the sound of its hooves changed, softer now, echoing faintly against stone and packed dirt, and Ethan let the reins rest easy in his hands, trusting the animal more than any instinct that came too quickly, because out here, haste was often the first mistake a man made. And beside him, Naeli had gone still in a way that was not fear but recognition, her shoulders squared, her breathing steady, her eyes scanning the edges of the passage where shadows lingered longer than they should, and the wind that had followed them across the open land seemed to hesitate here, slipping through the narrow space in low, uneven currents that carried whispers of movement too distant to name. Then the horse stopped entirely, not from command, but from certainty, its ears forward, its body held in that quiet tension that spoke louder than any warning, and Ethan did not urge it on, did not press it forward, because forcing a step now would mean ignoring something already understood, and for a moment, the world held its breath, the kind of stillness that makes a man aware of every small detail, the shift of fabric, the faint creak of leather, the dry taste of dust in the air. And Naeli spoke, barely above a whisper, "We are not alone." And the words did not carry fear, only truth, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze lifting toward the ridge line where the light broke unevenly against the edge of stone. And there, just for a second, something moved, not fast, not sudden, but enough to catch the eye, a shape that blended with the land until it chose not to, and then another, and another, until the realization settled in not as shock, but as quiet understanding. They had been seen long before they had arrived. No weapons were raised. No voices called out. Only the presence itself, measured, patient, surrounding without closing in, like a circle drawn in air rather than on the ground. And Naeli exhaled slowly, something shifting in her expression, not relief exactly, but a release of tension that had been held too long. And she straightened slightly in the saddle, her chin lifting just enough to meet whatever watched them without lowering her gaze. And Ethan felt it then, the change in the moment, the subtle shift from uncertainty to something else, something that did not belong to him. And for the first time since leaving the town, he understood that this road had never truly been his to lead. A figure stepped forward onto the ridge, outlined against the pale sky, still enough to seem carved from the land itself. And though the distance was enough to hide details, there was no mistaking the posture, the quiet authority carried without effort, and more shapes appeared behind, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, and the number grew in a way that did not need counting to be understood. 1 became 5, 5 became more, until the passage no longer felt narrow because of the land, but because of the weight of the moment settling around them, and Ethan did not reach for anything, did not speak, because there was nothing to take and nothing to say that would not disturb what was unfolding. And Naeli's hand moved again, this time not in uncertainty, but with purpose, drawing the small silver pendant from beneath her clothing, letting it rest in the light where it could be seen clearly, and it caught the sun in a brief, steady glint, not bright, not demanding, but undeniable. And the figure on the ridge did not move closer, did not call out, yet something in the air changed all the same, like a question answered without being spoken, and the horse shifted beneath them, no longer tense, only waiting, as if it too understood that whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by something older, something carried not in words, but in the quiet recognition passing between those who had been watching all along. No one spoke, not from the ridge, not from the narrow path below, and in that silence, the distance between them seemed to carry more meaning than any words ever could. And Nayeli held the pendant steady in her hand, the silver catching the sunlight in a quiet, unwavering glow, and for a long moment, nothing happened until the figure on the ridge took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, not a move of challenge, not a move of retreat, but something in between, something that asked a question without demanding an answer, and the others behind him remained still, their presence unchanged, like stones that had always been there, watching, waiting. Ethan did not move either, his hands resting lightly, his posture loose but grounded, because he understood now that anything sudden, anything forced, would break whatever fragile thread had formed in the air between them. And beside him, Nayeli lowered her hand. Just slightly, not hiding the pendant, but letting it rest against her chest again, as if its purpose had already been served. And then she did something that shifted the weight of the moment in a way no one else could have. She spoke, her voice carrying across the narrow space, steady and clear, in a language that did not belong to the town they had left behind, a language shaped by wind and memory. And though Ethan could not understand the words, he understood the tone, the calm certainty, the absence of fear, and the figure on the ridge listened without interruption, his head tilting just enough to show that he heard not only what was said, but what was meant beneath it. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It had changed, softened in a way that made the air feel less heavy, and the man on the ridge gave a slight nod, a gesture small enough that it could have been missed if anyone had been looking for something larger. And then, one by one, the figures behind him began to shift, not advancing, not surrounding, but stepping back just enough to open the passage ahead, creating a path where there had been none, and the movement was quiet, almost ceremonial, as if it followed a rule older than any of them. Nayeli let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and for the first time since the town, her shoulders lowered, the tension easing not into weakness, but into something steadier, something rooted, and she turned her head slightly toward Ethan, her eyes meeting his again, and this time there was something different there, not just a question, not just uncertainty, but recognition, as if she was seeing him more clearly than before, and he met that gaze without trying to define it, because some things did not need naming to be understood. "You knew," she said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating what had become clear, and Ethan looked ahead at the path that had opened before them, the land stretching beyond the narrow walls into something wide and unbroken, and he answered in the same steady tone he had carried from the beginning. "I knew enough," and the words held no pride, no explanation, only the truth as he understood it, and she studied him for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, as if that was all the answer she needed. The horse shifted beneath them again, no longer hesitant, its body relaxed, waiting for direction, and this time, Ethan did not hesitate. A light pressure of his heel was enough, and the animal moved forward, stepping into the space that had been given, not taken, and as they passed beneath the ridge, the presence of those above remained, silent, watchful, but no longer uncertain, and the wind returned, moving through the passage, with a softer voice, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and something else, something that felt like acknowledgement, and as they rode on, leaving the narrow place behind them, it became clear that what had happened was not a confrontation avoided, but a truth revealed, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood by those who had witnessed it. The land beyond the passage did not rush to welcome them. It unfolded slowly, ridge by ridge, shadow by shadow, as if testing whether they belonged in it at all, and the horse carried them forward at a measured pace, its breathing steady now, its steps no longer cautious but certain, and behind them, though they did not turn to look, the presence on the ridge remained, not following, not fading, simply there, like a memory that would not need to be revisited to be remembered, and for a long stretch of miles, nothing interrupted the quiet except the wind and the low creak of saddle leather, and it was in that quiet that something began to change, not in the land, but between them. Nayeli shifted slightly, her hand resting again near the pendant at her chest, not clutching it this time, just touching it lightly, as if to confirm it was still there, and she spoke without looking back, her voice softer than before. "You could have left me there." And Ethan let the words settle before answering, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the heat bent the air into something almost unreal. "Yes," he said, and nothing more at first, and she waited, not for an explanation, but because silence, she had learned, often carried the rest of a man's truth, and after a moment, he added, "But that would have been easier." And there was something in the way he said it, not regret, not pride, but a quiet acknowledgement of the path he had chosen, and she turned her head slightly, studying him again, as if trying to understand a man who measured his actions not by what he gained, but by what he refused to accept. The sun had begun its slow descent, stretching shadows longer across the ground, and the air cooled just enough to carry a different scent now, something faint and distant, like smoke carried from a place too far to see. And Nayeli noticed it first, her posture shifting, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she scanned the land ahead. And Ethan felt it a moment later, the subtle change in the wind, the way it carried more than dust now. And he did not ask, because he knew she would speak if it mattered, and she did, after a few more steps. "We are close," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, only certainty. And that was when he understood that this journey had never been about distance alone. It had been about direction, about returning something that had been taken out of its place and setting it back where it belonged. The land rose again ahead, but this time it did not feel like a barrier. It felt like an entrance, wide and open in a way that did not announce itself. And as they approached, shapes began to form in the distance, not hidden, not watching from above, but standing in the open, waiting, and they did not move as the riders came closer, did not signal or call out. They simply stood, their presence calm and unyielding, and Nayeli drew in a slow breath, her shoulders lifting and settling as if something long carried was finally being set down, and Ethan felt it too, the shift in the air, the way the land itself seemed to recognize what was returning to it. And for the first time since leaving the town, he allowed himself to slow, not out of caution, but out of respect, because whatever waited ahead was not something to be rushed. And as they closed the final distance, the figures became clearer, their number more than a handful, more than a group, enough to fill the space without crowding it. And still, no one spoke, no one moved to greet them. And that silence, deeper than any before, held something undeniable, something that told Ethan he had reached the edge of a truth he had only begun to understand. And beside him, Nayeli sat taller now, no longer the woman from the saloon, but someone else entirely, someone the land itself seemed to recognize. And as the horse took its final steps toward the waiting figures, the wind stilled, as if even it understood that what came next did not belong to noise, but to something far quieter and far more lasting. They did not announce themselves, not with voices, not with movement, and yet their presence filled the open ground in a way that left no doubt about who they were. And as the horse came to a natural stop a few yards from where the first line of figures stood, the world seemed to settle into a stillness that felt deliberate, as if even the wind had chosen to step aside and watch. And Ethan remained seated, his hands loose, his posture unchanged, because he understood now that this moment did not belong to him. And beside him, Nayeli did not wait. She moved with a quiet certainty, sliding down from the saddle in one smooth motion, her boots touching the earth as if returning to something that had always been hers. And when she stood, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a calm presence that carried farther than any word could have. The figures ahead shifted then, not all at once, not in a way that drew attention to itself, but enough to open a path between them. And at the center of that path stood an older man, his posture straight despite the years written across his face, his gaze steady and unyielding. And though no title was spoken, no name given, it was clear that he was the one the others watched, the one whose silence held weight. And Nayeli stepped forward toward him, each step measured, each breath steady. And when she reached him, she did not bow her head, did not lower her eyes. She simply stood, meeting his gaze as an equal, and for a long moment, neither moved, neither spoke, until the older man lifted his hand slightly, not in command, but in acknowledgement, and the gesture passed through those gathered like a ripple across still water. Then, slowly, one by one, the others followed, not stepping forward, not raising their voices, but lowering themselves to one knee. The movement quiet, deliberate, and it spread outward in a widening circle until the open ground was filled with that single, unified motion, and Ethan watched from the saddle, not with surprise, but with a quiet understanding that settled deeper with each passing second, because what he was seeing was not submission, not obedience, but respect given freely, the kind that could not be taken, only earned, and at the center of it, Nayeli stood unchanged, her posture steady, her gaze forward, and the pendant at her chest caught the light again, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain, but visible in a way that made its meaning clear even to someone who did not know its story. The older man spoke then, his voice low but carrying across the space with a clarity that did not need volume, and though the words were not in a language Ethan understood, the tone was unmistakable, not questioning, not accusing, but confirming, something that had already been decided. And Nayeli answered in the same calm voice she had used before, her words steady, her expression unwavering, and when she finished, the older man gave a single nod, deeper this time, final, and the air itself seemed to shift with it, as if something long unsettled had just been placed back where it belonged. For a moment longer, the stillness held, and then Nayeli turned, not toward the others, but back toward Ethan, her eyes finding his with a clarity that had not been there before. And in that look was the truth he had sensed from the beginning, not spoken, not explained, but undeniable. She had never been something to take, never been something to own, and he had known it, even when the town had not, and he did not smile, did not nod, did not mark the moment in any visible way, because there was nothing to claim, nothing to prove, and as the last of the figures remained kneeling in quiet respect, the meaning of it settled over the land like a shadow at sunset, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. No one rushed to fill the silence after the last word was spoken, and in that stillness, something settled that did not need to be named, something that belonged to the land as much as it did to the people standing upon it. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching without staring, present without stepping forward, because he understood that whatever had just been restored had never been his to carry beyond this point. And then, slowly, he shifted his weight in the saddle, the leather creaking softly beneath him, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been in a place where everything else had gone quiet. And Nayeli saw it, her gaze returning to him, steady and clear, and for a brief moment, the world narrowed again to just the space between them, not filled with questions this time, not with uncertainty, but with something simpler, something that did not ask for words. She stepped closer, not hurried, not hesitant, and when she reached the horse, she placed her hand lightly against its side, the same way she had before, familiar, grounded, and she looked up at him, her voice calm. "You brought me back," she said, and it was not a thank you, not quite. It was an acknowledgement of what had been done without trying to measure it, and Ethan met her gaze, the brim of his hat casting a shadow that softened the lines of his face. "No," he answered quietly. "You were always going there." And the words held no modesty, no attempt to turn away from what he had chosen, only the truth as he saw it. And for a second, something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not doubt, but recognition of a kind that reached deeper than anything spoken before, and she gave a small nod, the kind that did not end a conversation but completed it. Behind her, the others remained where they were, still and silent, their presence unchanged, not pressing forward, not withdrawing, simply witnessing, and the older man watched as well, his gaze resting on Ethan now, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with a quiet measure that did not need explanation, and after a moment, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone looking for something greater, but it carried weight all the same, and Ethan acknowledged it with the smallest movement, nothing more, because anything more would have taken from what had already been given. The sun dipped lower, painting the land in long stretches of amber and shadow, and the wind returned in a softer voice, moving through the open ground with a steady, unbroken rhythm, and Ethan turned the horse then, not sharply, not as a retreat, but as a continuation, guiding it back toward the open land they had crossed. And this time, there was no hesitation in the movement, no pause to reconsider, just the quiet certainty of a man who knew his part in the story had reached its end. Naeli stepped back, giving him space without stepping away entirely, her posture straight, her presence unchanged, and she watched as he began to ride, her eyes following not with longing, not with loss, but with understanding. And as the distance grew between them, neither called out, neither raised a hand, because some endings did not need to be marked, they only needed to be honored. And the land stretched wide once more, the narrow passage far behind, the town even farther, and Ethan Cole rode on beneath the fading light, leaving nothing behind him but a moment that would not be spoken of in words, only remembered in the quiet way people carried truths they had once doubted. Because out here, a man was not measured by what he claimed, but by what he refused to take, and that was enough.